Hello and welcome to your continuation in our Chapter 20 lecture. We are going to start off with section 20.3 on capillary exchange, and I tried to keep this simple. We're going to talk about at the capillary, how does this exchange take place? Why does it take place? And it's all due to this net filtration pressure. This is going to be the force that's responsible for moving contents across this capillary wall. And there are two forces that are going to affect pressure here. We've got our net hydrostatic pressure minus our net osmotic pressure. Okay, what does that mean? So with hydrostatic pressure, that's going to be our physical pressure of our blood that is flowing through the vessel, or of the fluid in these interstitial spaces. And then our osmotic pressure is the movement of the solutes, whether it's going to be plasma in here or tissue fluid out here, through a membrane, which would be our plasma membrane in here, in the presence of a non-diffusible solute. So let's say we had a large protein present. And if we had a large protein present, let's say in the blood over here, that cannot freely pass out the capillary walls, and the difference in protein concentrations between the blood and our interstitial fluid out here is responsible for osmosis, meaning that water is the thing that's moving here. So let's take a look at what happens as we move through a capillary bed. Here's our arterial end. This is like our mid-capillary, and this is our venous end. So at our arterial end, we see that fluid is going to be exiting our capillary since our hydrostatic pressure here is 35 millimeters mercury, which is greater than our blood colloidal osmotic pressure, which is 25. So our net filtration pressure is going to be positive 10 millimeters mercury, and we are going to want to flow out. So we get filtration that takes place. Now here you can see mid-capillary, these pressures are going to be even at 25 millimeters mercury, so there's going to be no movement that takes place. But then once we get to our venous end, we'll see that our hydrostatic pressure has dropped here. It's at 18 millimeters mercury, and our osmotic pressure has stayed the same at 25 millimeters mercury. So now when we do hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure, we get negative 7 millimeters mercury, and we're going to have reabsorption take place, and we're going to pull substances into the venous end, which is good because at the arterial end, we want to give off those nutrients, give off those oxygen molecules, whereas at the venous end, we want to pull in the carbon dioxide and other waste products, and then continue on our merry way into a venule. Now let's go into section 20.4, which is going to be on the hemostatic regulation of the vascular system. So we have neural regulation within our cardiovascular centers in the brain, which take place here at this vasomotor center in the medulla. Here we're going to have some special centers in addition to our vasomotor center. In here, we also have a cardio accelerator center, and that's going to help to regulate our heart rate and stroke volume via the sympathetic stimulation from cardiac accelerator nerves. And then we have a cardio inhibitor center, and that's going to work to decrease the heart rate and stroke volume through our parasympathetic stimulation from the vagus nerve. So this kind of makes sense, right? Inhibitor means we're like stopping something. So we're decreasing, and our parasympathetic is our rest and digest. We're stopping and we're resting. Whereas our accelerator, that's going to cause an increase usually, or it's going to keep like a steady heart rate. And that is done by our sympathetic stimulation, which is our fight or flight response. And then we have our vasomotor centers. These help to control the tone, the vessel tone, or the contraction of our smooth muscle, which you see pictured over here. in the tunica media. So we'll see changes in the diameter that affect peripheral resistance, pressure, and flow, which affects our cardiac output. And the majority of these neurons are going to act through a neurotransmitter, norepinephrine, from our sympathetic neurons. And then you've seen this figure before in chapter 19, so I'm not going to walk through it again. This is our baroreceptor reflex in order to maintain our blood pressure. And this is a verbiage to kind of re-explain it. And then we have this figure from OpenStax, where we're walking through the same steps as in the figure that we saw. We just incorporated the centers we discussed. So if we have increased blood pressure, our baroreceptors start firing, telling us that, hey, there's a problem, we've got too high of a blood pressure. So we're going to use our cardiac inhibitor, right? Because that starts to decrease our heart rate and stroke volume. So essentially we're decreasing our cardiac output. We're going to decrease the cardiac accelerator that usually steadies or increases our heart rate. And then our vasomotor center is also going to decrease, which means we are going to get vasodilation take place. And that causes our blood pressure to drop and back to homeostasis. When our blood pressure decreases, we are going to get our baroreceptor firing as well, telling us, hey, we've got too low of a blood pressure, and we're going to do just the opposite and get vasoconstriction to take place. We increase cardiac output. That increases our blood pressure back to its homeostasis level. And then same thing with our chemoreceptors. We talked about this in chapter 20, so I won't go through it again. This is the verbiage to explain it all, and then a little repeat of the same figure from chapter 20. So we are going to skip through the poll questions since we are not live and get right to our endocrine regulation now. Our hormones are also able to regulate our blood pressure in short term through changes in peripheral resistance and in long term through changes in our blood volume. So something that helps us do this are the hormones that our adrenal medulla releases. So that's what I like to call the party hat that sits on top of the kidney. And the medulla is this inner portion in here. So when we have our blood pressure drop, we want to have the brain signal out through our sympathetic nerve fiber to our adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine from our adrenal gland, and this will help to increase our cardiac output and cause vasoconstriction. And then we have angiotensin 2. I know this looks like a very confusing figure, but just focus on the part I'm showing you right now. And it'll all make sense in a minute. So angiotensin 2 is going to be a hormone that causes vasoconstriction. If we are vasoconstricting, we're narrowing our blood vessel lumen. So we are going to increase blood pressure in that way. And then we also have ADH, and this causes vasoconstriction as well. So the way we are going to think of this, actually, let me start over here. When we see a drop in blood pressure, our kidney is going to release a hormone known as renin. And renin is in charge of taking this inactive form, which is angiotensinogen, and turns it into angiotensin 1. And then we get this ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, from the lungs that turns angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. So this causes vasoconstriction and will also cause these other things to take place, and we're going to talk about this more when we get into the urinary system. But right now I just want you to know here that we're going to increase ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, from the posterior pituitary gland, and that's going to cause us to absorb more water, which increases our blood volume, right? We're adding water to our blood. And so we are going to be able to increase our blood pressure because we get increased blood volume and also vasoconstriction from angiotensinogen. And then we have aldosterone, which we're going to talk about in your urinary system. So a little bit more on that antidiuretic hormone. The way this works is we have these special receptors in your hypothalamus that are called osmoreceptors, and they detect any increased osmotic pressure in our body. But one that we already discussed are the baroreceptors that we find in the aorta and the carotid artery, and these are detecting any changes in blood pressure. So this is going to, or this hormone is going to be used when we have a decrease in blood pressure. So both of these components will kind of talk to each other in the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus decides, hey, I need to make and release antidiuretic hormone. And what that does is it goes over to the blood vessels and tells it to vasoconstrict, and it also goes over to the kidneys and says, you guys need to reabsorb more water. So just like we discussed in the previous slide, absorbing more water is going to increase your blood volume, and then the vasoconstriction will increase your blood pressure. And now for some long-term mechanisms for blood pressure, we need to alter the blood volume through our kidneys. And so we can do this through a direct renal mechanism where we're altering blood volume by either eliminating more urine or conserving water within the kidneys. And we're going to talk more about this in our urinary system. But the one we are interested in right now is this indirect renal mechanism known as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. So let's talk about that next. And I'm going to discuss that in this figure, even though if you want, you can reference back to this one as well. But the first thing we're going to see is that we have a decrease in blood pressure. We said we go over to the kidneys, and the kidneys secrete renin. And renin is the one, once again, responsible for taking this inactive angiotensinogen, which by the way comes from the liver, and it turns into its active form, which is angiotensin 1. Then we need this enzyme from the lungs known as angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, to convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And we already know that angiotensin 2 is going to cause vasoconstriction, which increases blood pressure. And the other thing that it does is it goes over to our adrenal cortex. Not the adrenal medulla that released the epinephrine and norepinephrine, but the adrenal cortex. An adrenal cortex releases a hormone known as aldosterone. And aldosterone, I like to always remember this as the first word is Aldo. And no offense to anybody working at Aldo, but I like to think of them as being very salty. And so they are going to reabsorb salt in the kidney. And what did we say about salt and water? Anywhere salt goes, water wants to go. So by reabsorbing salt, we also are able to reabsorb water. That's going to increase our blood volume. An increase in blood volume means we have an increase in blood pressure. Okay, and here is another figure that walks you through some of those things that we discussed in the short term. If we have a decrease in blood volume, we can use epinephrine and norepinephrine from our adrenal glands, specifically in the medulla. That's going to increase cardiac output and vasoconstriction. That increases our blood pressure. For the long term, we can use that renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism, which I won't walk you through it for a third time. And then the next thing we're going to learn about is erythropoietin. This is also released from the kidneys and is going to increase red blood cell formation, which increases our blood volume and will increase our blood pressure. So here it is, erythropoietin, also known as EPO. This, once again, is released from the kidneys when we start to see that blood flow or oxygen levels or blood volume is decreased. And it stimulates our red blood cells within our bone marrow to increase, the production of it to increase. So in somebody that is anemic, we start to see that we have low oxygen, our tissues are not being oxygenated, so the kidney gets a signal to release the hormone erythropoietin, and that goes over to our bone marrow and tells it to produce more red blood cells, and then we get normal red blood cell production. Now, sometimes athletes misuse this and will take erythropoietin or might even inject themselves with extra red blood cells in order to get more oxygen to enhance their performance. But what that does is it thickens their blood, it increases their blood viscosity. And what does that in turn do? It's going to affect their blood flow and cause resistance. So that is not going to be ideal for your health. Now we have another hormone. This is known as your atrial natriuretic hormone, or ANH, and this is also called your atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. So both of those are the same exact things. You could see ANP is used in this figure. And we are going to use this hormone when we have too high of blood volume, okay? Or too high of blood pressure even. So the reason we have the word atrial in here is because this is actually secreted from the cells in the atria of your heart. Natriuretic is referring to salt, and hormone is because it's a hormone. So, like I said, this is secreted when our blood volume is high. And when we have too much blood volume in this atria, it starts stretching the cardiac muscle cells in that atrial chamber. So then we are going to send a signal to decrease renin so that it'll decrease the amount of angiotensin II and aldosterone. And remember, aldosterone caused sodium reabsorption. We kept salt in our body. So now we're going to do the opposite. We want to lose that sodium, so we lose water, and in turn we're decreasing blood volume. The other thing that AMP does is it causes vasodilation, and that drops our blood pressure. So we are losing fluid from the body and decreasing our blood pressure because of this atrial natriuretic hormone. And we'll skip these poll questions. And we are back to our circulatory pathways, our second to last section. So what I'm going to do now is switch to a screen in which you are going to see a figure of a body, and we're going to draw out some of the more important vessels within your body. So actually, just for this first part on pulmonary circulation, we're not going to draw this out since we covered it in chapter 20. So let's just review pulmonary circulation. We are going to have pulmonary circulation take place when we are in the right ventricle. We move up through that pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, and that divides into your pulmonary arteries, where we have a right one and a left one, so 2 total. And this pulmonary artery, see how the blood is going away from the heart? That's a definition of an artery, right? And this happens to contain low oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood. So then it carries it into the lungs. Here we have capillaries that are going to surround that alveoli. So the oxygen that we breathe into that alveoli, those air sacs, that oxygen is going to cross the respiratory membrane and come into these capillaries. Well, now this blood is oxygenated and is going to travel through the pulmonary veins back to the left atrium. And notice how we have 2 pulmonary veins on the left and 2 pulmonary veins on the right. All 4 of these are going to go into the left atrium. And that's your pulmonary circulation. So now let's go into our overview of systemic arteries, starting with the aorta. Okay, so now I've got my little figure here. Hopefully this isn't too small for you. And I'm going to start out by just drawing a heart. We know that the aorta is going to come off of the heart. So I'm going to kind of draw this a little dramatically on here. There's my aorta, and we'll continue it down in a second. This is very sloppy, but hopefully you get what I'm doing here. So our aorta has 3 different parts. We have a ascending aorta, so I'm going to put just an A there for ascending. Then we have our aortic arch, so I'm going to put double A's there. You can label it better on yours. And then we have a descending aorta. So I'm going to put a D. Oh, see, this is not working well. Okay, I'm back on track. So I'm going to put a D, A in here. That's our descending aorta. So I'm going to zoom in so we can talk about some of the structures that we have coming off of here. Maybe I should have zoomed in to begin with. Let me clean this up. Doesn't that look so much better? Okay. So we talked about in the ascending aorta region, I know that I don't have this in the verbiage, but you can almost draw these little vessels coming down here and put CA for coronary arteries. Remember, those are supplying the heart muscle itself, and they're the first arteries to come off of the aorta. Now, off of our aortic arch, we have our brachiocephalic trunk, our left common carotid. I'm trying to point to it, but it's not letting me. And then our left subclavian artery. So they are going to branch off over here on our aortic arch. So the first thing that we are going to draw is our brachiocephalic trunk. And we're going to find this on the right-hand side. And I'm just going to put BCT in here since I have small space. You, of course, can draw lines and write these terms out in the white space outside of the body. So your brachiocephalic trunk, if you break that name down, brachio is referring to the arm, cephalic is referring to the head. And that's because we're going to have some arteries that branch off of here and go to the head and the arm. But before we talk about that, let's draw in our other branches off of the aortic arch. So we are also going to have a common carotid artery. This one is going to be our left common carotid artery. Okay, spelling is on the slide. And the last branch off of the aortic arch is going to be your left subclavian artery. So this is actually going to travel into your arm. Okay, so this is going to be my left subclavian. I'm going to put SC for subclavian artery. Okay, so if we go back to that brachiocephalic trunk, we need some carotid and subclavian arteries there. So off of this trunk, we're going to go to the arm. This is going to be my right subclavian artery. Everything in the body tries to be symmetrical for the most part. So the other artery I'm going to have branching off of my brachiocephalic trunk is going to be my right common carotid artery. Okay, so remember that your heart is a little bit to the left, right? That sounded confusing. Your heart is found on the left of the thorax. So I needed my little extension cord of that brachiocephalic trunk to bring those vessels, the subclavian artery and the common carotid artery, over to the right side of my body. That's why it's there. And then the last thing I want to mention before we change slides is that your descending aorta is more specific than just descending aorta. In your, on the floor of your thoracic cage, we have the diaphragm, right? So this black line is going to represent my diaphragm for now. And so the portion of the descending aorta that is continuing down through the thorax, this is going to be called my thoracic aorta. Still the descending aorta, but I just know that I'm talking about the portion that is in my thorax. And then down here in the abdomen, this is going to be my abdominal aorta. Oh my gosh, I just realized the tip of my pen is bent a little, and that's why I'm writing so sloppy. Okay. Anyway, let's move on from our slide. So we have some structures in the head, some vessels in the head that we need to know. For your exam, the ones that I want you to know are the internal and external carotid. And just, we're not going to draw this one in, but the vertebral artery. And we'll also talk about the superficial temporal artery. So let's focus on the area of the head here. We labeled in our common carotid arteries. Those are traveling up our neck, and remember, we can use those in order to measure our pulse. So once we get in the head, we are going to see these branch, and I'm just going to do it on one side. You could do it on both if you'd like. Of course, this one doesn't really branch straight to the ear like that, but we want to stay on the periphery. This is going to be known as your external carotid artery. I'm just going to put A. Of course, this is your left external carotid artery. And over here, I guess I am going to draw it on the right hand side. We are going to have our right external carotid artery. I hope I didn't say external common carotid. That's not a thing. It's just external carotid artery. And then the other branch we are going to have off of that common carotid artery is going to be the internal carotid artery. And notice I'm drawing this a little bit higher up and toward the center because this is going to go and supply our brain. Whereas the external carotid artery is going to supply structures more in our face and our neck. So this is going to be our left internal carotid artery. Again, I apologize for the handwriting. I didn't realize my stylus was broken. So the other thing we need to take a look at is if you look at the slide, the PowerPoint slide, you can see coming off of this external carotid artery and moving up toward the temple is going to be your superficial temporal artery. And this is going to be the artery that kind of pulsates along the side of your temples as you chew. And we can use it if you have like one of those infrared thermometers. We can use some of the branches in order to get a reading for fever. And then the other artery I wanted you to be aware of is the vertebral artery. Notice how that is moving through the transverse foramen of those cervical vertebrae, and that vertebral artery comes off of the subclavian artery on both sides. Okay. This one I'm not going to draw out, so let's just follow along on the slide. So here we can see that vertebral artery we just saw moving up the cervical vertebrae. It's going to move up through that foramen magnum, and it comes together with the other side and creates a basilar artery. From there, we're going to see branches of the posterior cerebral artery. You'll see that internal carotid artery that was moving up over here. And we'll see an anterior cerebral artery. And in between there, we see some communicating arteries. And also our middle cerebral artery will go and supply the middle portion of the brain. So I don't want you to memorize the connections of all of these, but just know that these vessels all together create something known as the circle of Willis. This was named after a brain surgeon known as Thomas Willis, and he discovered this, that it supplies the brain, and it is also known as the cerebral supply of the brain. All right, now let's move into the area of the thorax and the abdomen. So we have so far drawn this portion of the aorta. We talked about the branches up here toward the head and toward the upper limb. So now we're going to follow that thoracic aorta, and notice in here that we are giving off some branches that are going to be some visceral branches of the thoracic aorta and some parietal branches of the thoracic aorta. I just want you to know that they are found here in the thorax. Now, once we pass the diaphragm, we're going to talk about some of these structures in here and draw it on our diagram. So let me readjust. And we are going to take a look at some vessels over here. The first one that comes off is your celiac trunk, or CT. And that celiac trunk is going to give off 3 separate branches. So I'm going to draw this out here and just abbreviate so you can see the spelling on the PowerPoint. We have our left gastric artery that branches off of that celiac trunk. We also have your splenic artery, and yes, there's just one, so it's just splenic artery. And the last one to branch off there is the common hepatic artery, CH. And yes, there's only one of that as well. So the abdomen's a little bit different in that not everything is going to be right and left. We might just have one vessel for each. So you might have guessed what these vessels supply. Your left gastric is going to go and supply your stomach. Splenic is going to go and supply your spleen. And common hepatic will go and supply your liver. Beyond that, we are going to see, again, just one artery branching off right below that celiac trunk, and that is going to be your superior mesenteric. Superior mesenteric. You can see the spelling on the right-hand side, 4th label up from the bottom. And your superior mesenteric artery supplies your small intestines and the first portions of your large intestines. If we follow that abdominal aorta further down, we will also see another single branch coming off, and this is called your inferior mesenteric, and that's going to supply the remainder of your large intestines. Now, some other branches that we will see coming off of this abdominal aorta would be like your renal arteries, and we have a left and right one. So I'm just going to put, this one is going to be your right renal artery, and this will be your left renal artery, and it'll go to supply your kidneys. And I think those are all the ones that I wanted you to know in the abdomen. Now, once we get down toward the pelvic region at the level of LV4, lumbar vertebrae number 4, this descending aorta or abdominal aorta is going to split. So it splits like this, and this is going to be now called your common iliac artery. So this will be your left common iliac artery. This will be your right common iliac artery, and it really is short. It's about 5 centimeters long, and then it's going to split again. So anytime you see that word common in something, it usually means that it's going to split into an internal and an external. So these that I drew in, these are going to be your internal iliac arteries. Okay, we have our right and left. And the other branch is going to be your external iliac artery. So this one will be my left external iliac artery, and this will be my right external iliac artery. Now, where this external iliac artery ends is through a prominent structure, and I'm drawing this a little bit off, but this structure is going to be your inguinal ligament. Inguinal, I know I'm getting cut off there, ligament. And this inguinal ligament spans from the pubic tubercle to that as is, that anterior superior iliac spine on your hip. And you can see it in this figure a little bit. It's that white angled piece of tissue down in the pelvis. That's your inguinal ligament. So your iliac artery, your external iliac artery, is going to change its name once it passes that ligament. So here are some nice figures from OpenStax that really makes it simple as far as the branches of arteries and how they're connected and what they supply. So I really love these figures. You can go through and use these to study, but you might want to cross off some of the more detailed structures, such as the mediastinal arteries here, the bronchial arteries, pericardial arteries, and so forth. Okay, so before we get into the lower limb, we are going to go back up to the upper limb to finish off this subscapular artery in green. So once we pass the first rib, our subclavian artery is going to change its name, and it changes its name to the axillary artery. Which makes sense because this artery is passing through the area of your armpit. And I'm sure you could draw that a lot better than I can right now. And then it's going to change its name once again once it passes the teres major muscle. And it is now going to be called your brachial artery. What did we use the brachial artery for? What did we use it to measure? It was blood pressure. Hopefully you got that right. Okay, and then once we get to the region of the elbow, this brachial artery bifurcates. It splits, and we have our radial artery. And of course, this would be a right radial artery because we have a left radial artery in the other limb. And the other vessel that we're going to split in from the brachial artery is the ulnar artery. Okay, and then of course beyond this we do have some other branches, like your ulnar artery creates your superficial palmar arch, your radial artery helps create your deep palmar arch, and they branch into digital arteries to supply the fingers, but we are not going to add that detail to our photo here. Here are some of those nice diagrams from OpenStax, but we're going to finish off our drawing by looking at the lower limb here. So like we said, that aorta, as it descends down the abdomen, the aorta is going to split into those common iliac arteries, which then divide into the internal and external iliac arteries. And once that external iliac artery passes this inguinal ligament, we are going to change its name to, we keep using the same colors over and over again, we're going to change the name to femoral artery. So we're just going to go through the thigh here with our femoral artery. Okay, and this is an interesting path. I'm glad we have this figure so you can see an anterior and posterior view. That femoral artery descends on down, and as it's moving anteriorly along the thigh, about midway through, look how it passes behind the femur. So now as we talk about this vessel on our figure, I'm going to almost draw like a dotted line to show that we are going to go posterior to the knee, and this is now my popliteal artery. So if I ask you, what artery do you find posterior to the knee? It is the popliteal artery. Now your popliteal artery, after passing the region of the knee, is also going to bifurcate, just like how we saw with our upper limb with that brachial artery splitting into ulnar and radial. So now we are going to have a branch that is going to be your anterior tibial artery, and of course these are all right arteries. Everything is matching on the left. And then we have a posterior tibial artery that'll stay posterior. Okay, so I'm going to draw this as a dotted line to show it's posterior, posterior, tibial artery. And a branch that comes off of this posterior tibial artery is your fibular artery. And I should have drawn this a little bit the other way. Maybe I can sneak it back in here because your fibular artery is going to be found a bit more lateral. I know this is terrible, but hopefully yours looks more beautiful. Fibular artery. Just know that that branches off of the posterior tibial artery. And then poor anterior tibial artery, it wants a fun buddy too. So we are going to give it a friend down here in the ankle. And this is going to be your dorsalis pedis artery. And this is a really important artery because we can use it as a pulse point. And if we feel a weak pulse in this dorsalis pedis artery, then that means we might have someone suffering from peripheral arterial disease in which they're not getting enough blood supply to their extremities, to the end of their extremities. So you might have something like cyanosis taking place to their toes. By the way, fibular artery is also called peroneal artery. Those terms are interchangeable. And here's a nice little figure on that. Now we're going to go into veins. So you have another page here. And here's a list of some of the arteries we went over. Okay, so with this figure, we are separating it into a superficial side and a deep side. Our veins are returning blood back to the heart, right? And so we do this in two ways, our superficial and our deep. So the ones that you've learned about already are your coronary sinus, superior vena cava, and your inferior vena cava, and these are deep veins. But we also have some superficial ones that we are going to draw on it's going to be our patient's right side of their body, and then we'll draw the deep on the left. So let's first talk about some of our deep veins. So I'm not going to draw this out because we have our body kind of split in half, but you can see this best on the PowerPoint. So off of the heart, we have your superior vena cava and your inferior vena cava. We've got these branches, and remember, we're going to kind of come back to the heart. So it's almost like the blood is flowing from extremities back to the center of the body. So let's first talk about, they have it labeled over here, your subclavian vein, I want you to know, comes together with your internal jugular vein. So the artery that we had here in the neck, it was called the common carotid artery, right? We don't have matching names for the vein here. So your internal jugular vein and your external jugular vein are all draining into this subclavian vein, which then come together to create your brachiocephalic vein. And here, we're not calling this a trunk. We have a left brachiocephalic vein and a right brachiocephalic vein. And both of these right and left brachiocephalic veins drain into the superior vena cava. Now with your inferior vena cava, it sits side by side with that descending aorta, but now the blood is moving up. Okay, so we will draw some of these veins in here. Let's move on and first talk about some of these veins in the head and neck. So the first ones I want to point out are these sinuses. So there are really three different kinds of veins. We have superficial ones that you can see right under your skin. So if you look at the back of your hand, you can see maybe some of the veins in there. We have the deep ones, which you don't see, and then we have these sinusoids or sinuses, which are found in the skull. And so we are going to drain this blood back from the brain, and they are all eventually going to drain into your internal jugular vein that we just talked about, that then connects with your subclavian vein. So the internal jugular vein is the main one I want you to know in this photo. The external jugular vein is going to drain mostly like your scalp, your face, your neck, whereas the internal jugular vein is kind of draining your brain. Okay, and we talked about that right subclavian vein draining your upper limb. So let's talk about some of these veins in your upper limb. So I'm going to go back to our drawing here, if it cooperates with me. So we are going to start with our superficial side. And so we will draw 3 veins here to show the superficial veins. And I'm going to just draw these as lines. On the lateral side of the upper limb, we have this superficial vein known as your cephalic vein. Okay? And then on the medial side of your upper limb, and I just want to make clear, this is the same on both sides. We're just drawing the superficial side to make our drawing as clear as possible. So on the medial side of the upper limb, we are going to have this basilic vein. Basilic vein. And these are labeled on the PowerPoint slide as well. And in between those 2 veins, we have a vein that usually is used to draw blood, and this is called your median cubital vein. Median cubital vein. So that's all I want you to know for superficial veins of your upper limb. Now we are going to go to the deep side of our body, and you're going to see that everything is going to copy our arteries. But what I'm going to do is start on the distal side, because this is the direction that blood is flowing. So here is going to be my ulnar vein. So UV for ulnar vein, again on the medial side of the forearm. And we have a radial vein, and notice how they're coming together here. There's my radial vein. And they are going to come together and form a brachial vein. So BV for brachial vein. That brachial vein is then going to carry blood into the axillary vein. And from the axillary vein, we are going to drain that into our subclavian vein. And we know that the subclavian vein will drain into your brachiocephalic vein, which then drains into your superior vena cava to bring it back to the heart. Okay, so next, there's our schematics. Next, let's do our lower limb. So let's start off with the deep side since we're already on this side. And once again, we have the same exact names pretty much. So we'll start off with our anterior tibial vein. Okay, and then we have the posterior tibial vein. And of course, that branch, that friend of posterior tibial vein, I'm just going to put an F by it. The fibular vein or the peroneal vein drains into the posterior tibial vein. And then where we see the anterior and posterior tibial veins come together, that's going to drain into this popliteal vein. Popliteal vein, or some people like to pronounce it as popliteal. Okay, and then next, that's going to drain into our femoral vein. Okay, and once we pass that inguinal ligament, what's it going to change its name to? The external iliac vein. Okay, and then that comes together with the internal I'm just going to put an IV, internal iliac vein, to once again have our common iliac vein. And so the right common iliac vein and the left common iliac vein is then going to drain into our inferior vena cava. Inferior vena cava, which then goes all through the abdomen. Whoops. So I'm going to try, this is in the center, but we'll just go close to that line, which is going to go all the way up and then, of course, drain into the heart. Okay, here we can draw our superior vena cava. And since we're finishing things off, why not? Let's add that brachiocephalic vein as well. We'll put BCV there. Okay, so that was our deep side of our lower limb. Now let's do the superficial side. And there's only two veins to really know on our superficial side of the leg. We are going to have our longest vein in our body, which is our greater saphenous vein. Saphenous. And sometimes they call this the large saphenous vein. I don't know which one they used in this figure. Yeah, the great saphenous vein is what they call it. But you can use any one as long as you recognize it. And then we have our lesser saphenous vein, which I'm going to draw this as a dotted line because it actually goes along the posterior calf here. Okay, and this is my lesser or small saphenous vein. Okay, so what's interesting about these superficial veins is that they eventually will drain into a deep vein. So this lesser saphenous vein drains into the popliteal vein, and the greater saphenous vein drains into your femoral vein, so that these deeper veins can carry it back up to the heart. So when we look back at our upper limb, you don't have to know the upper limb ones, but I'm going to say it anyway. Your cephalic vein is going to drain into your axillary artery, and your basilic vein is going to drain into your brachial artery. Oh, I said artery, I mean veins. Your cephalic vein is going to drain into your axillary vein, and your basilic vein is going to drain into your brachial vein. Okay? All right, so we got that figure, and then I'm not going to draw this out either because we have this body split into superficial and deep. So let's go ahead and talk about your hepatic portal system real quick using these slides. And I really like the figures that we have here anyway to depict this. So in order to understand this hepatic portal system, which is referring to the blood flow through the liver, we need to understand what is going on with the food in the intestines here. So our food is moving through the intestines, and our job in the intestines is to absorb nutrients. So our arteries come down to the intestines. Remember that superior mesenteric artery? We'll just talk about that one. We've got oxygenated blood. It's given off to our intestines. And then in our intestines, we've got those nutrients from the food, right? So our veins here, specifically here's our superior mesenteric vein, is going to not only draw up the waste products and have that deoxygenated blood in it, but we're also going to have nutrients within this vein. So the superior mesenteric vein is going to move on up, and notice how it comes together with this splenic vein. And draining into the splenic vein is our inferior mesenteric vein, which, remember, that is going to drain the last part of our intestines here, of the large intestines, that is. So with this, we pull in the nutrient-rich oxygen poor blood from our inferior mesenteric, splenic vein, and superior mesenteric vein, and it all goes into this hepatic portal vein. That is then going to carry the blood into the liver. So when we carry it into the liver, we are going to have the hepatocytes here, or the liver cells, get the nutrients and maybe some possible toxins over here. And then that blood is going to flow back through hepatic veins into the inferior vena cava to be taken back to the heart. So what do we see here? There are actually 2 capillary beds, and that's what we mean by portal system. It means that we are going to have 2 capillary beds. So again, we had that artery come in to the intestines, give off the oxygen, and we went through the capillary bed, picked up those nutrients inside of the intestines and maybe some toxins if there were any in there. We went through the superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric, and splenic veins, and all of those merged to create that hepatic portal vein, which took it to the liver. We gave off the nutrients and toxins, and then through the hepatic vein went into the inferior vena cava to be taken back to the heart. So I want to flip back to this image here to show you that. So here's the hepatic portal vein. We have a little bit of splitting here so we can get all of those nutrients to those hepatocytes. And then here are the hepatic veins that connect back to the inferior vena cava to take it to the heart. Now this is going to help to maintain glucose homeostasis because we can store glucose as glycogen in the liver, and we can get that venous blood from our digestive system. All right, I think that is all we need to mention here about our hepatic portal system. This is another figure that I really like, to see that hepatic portal vein going into the liver, and then those hepatic veins carrying that now oxygen poor blood and nutrient poor blood into the inferior vena cava, right? Because we gave those nutrients to the liver. The oxygen got unloaded to our intestines by the arteries. And so I would walk through this a couple of times to make sure you got it. Last thing we're going to talk about is fetal circulation. I just wanted you to be aware that the fetal heart is not like the adult heart. So we do have some variations. Most of you are familiar with the umbilical cord. That is going to be made up of an umbilical vein and 2 umbilical arteries. So I should have put arteries here. But your umbilical vein is going to carry, it's the one in red here, it's going to carry oxygen-rich blood from the mother by this placenta to the fetus. And then the umbilical arteries, notice how the blue arteries here are going in the opposite direction because they are carrying oxygen depleted or oxygen poor blood from the fetus to the mother, to the placenta that belongs to the mother. What is placenta, by the way? This placenta is going to be able to provide oxygen and nutrients to the fetus and remove any waste products from the fetus's blood, and it attaches to the mother's uterus, and it takes about 3 months to build this. All right, so now when we focus on the heart, we've talked about some of these structures already, but I wanted to remind you that in the fetus, we have a foramen ovale between the right and left atrium, and once we're born, it turns into a fossa ovalis. We also have a structure known as the ductus arteriosus, and that is going to connect the pulmonary trunk to the aorta to bypass the lungs. And when we're born, that then turns into a ligament known as ligamentum arteriosum. And the last structure is going to be our ductus venosus. And this is going to be a branch from this umbilical vein that is going to have oxygenated blood within it that takes it straight to the heart. And after we're born, that is going to be known as our ligamentum venosum, and this is in place to bypass the liver until we're born. So that is it for chapter 20. I'm sorry we have this video at an hour long. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.